Welcome back to the world of Spirit and Shield. As always, my name is John and I will continue to be your guide on this journey. So today we have a brand new short story that takes us to the lands of the Apterii. This will be a new place we're exploring, so I'm really excited to hear what you guys think. So go ahead and take a listen, and if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and put them down below. But let's go ahead and jump right into today's story. Dragon Breaker. The man plummeted to the ground, his body spinning as he fell. By the way his arms and legs were flailing about, Accurate knew he was still alive. Accurate watched him, wondering all the while if the man thought that all that flailing would somehow help. It did not. The man continued to fall until his fall was interrupted by the ground and a gruesome death. Accurate watched it with curiosity, even amusement. Men do not belong in the sky. That is the domain of dragons. The man was simply returning to his natural place in the most expedient way possible. Accurate could have put him out of his misery, but why waste an arrow? Accurate turned his gaze back to the sky. He was Apterii, and though not dragons themselves, they claimed both dragon ancestry and mastery, having separated from and surpassed that line millennia ago. Sitting atop his own dragon, Accurate turned his beak into the wind and let it ripple his feathers. The battle continued below and around him. The demise of that one man did not complete the slaughter. Tirikit-ik, chikarit. Dragon, move now. Accurate said abruptly to his steed. The dragon dove, picking up speed and ruffling Accurate's feathers. Accurate leaned forward and held on with his knees. His hands held an ornately carved dragon-forged bronze bow. Though on the outskirts of the battle there were still plenty of targets, and Accurate began calmly picking them off one by one. The dragon he rode carried him lightly, responding quickly to the subtle commands given by the pressure of Accurate's knees. Even when enemy arrows threatened them, both rider and dragon remained steady. This was not their first battle. Spotting a small formation of enemy dragon riders, Accurate began firing at them. 3 arrows loosed, 2 riders fell. A third emerged from cloud cover and shot a fire lance at Accurate. The lance missed, but Accurate could feel its heat as it roared by. He fired an arrow quickly in response, but missed, wide right. Accurate's dragon tilted his great head and gave him a scowling look. It was a look Accurate was unfortunately well familiar with. Some dragons would not begrudge a miss, but not this one. He knew he had held his rider steady despite the near miss of the fire lance. All the blame was on Accurate, and they both knew it. Accurate snapped his beak together with a sharp click and shook his head furiously. The Apterii did not deal well with failure. To fail did not just show weakness, it was immoral. If an Apterii failed, it was not because circumstances prevented their success, but rather because they had not trained enough, studied enough, or worked hard enough. Their code of honor would not allow failure, and neither would their dragons. The dragon continued glaring at Accurate, the disdain smoldering in the embers of his eyes. Even in the midst of battle, Accurate could not forget the first time he saw those eyes, or that look. It wasn't nearly as large as he thought it would be. Holding it in his hands, he was afraid he might break it. He moved his hand over the surface, softly dragging a talon across. It wasn't leathery, but hard and so fragile. In truth, it reminded Accurate of his younger siblings, except that this one was a steely gray, whereas most of theirs had been brown. Accurate did not dare look up at the prince who handed him the egg. Instead, he bowed deeply, spreading his feathers wide as he did so. The prince remained silent. He remained still. He remained a brilliant statue of crimson and gold. His regal avian head was adorned with not just feathers, but jewels as well. Sapphires, rubies, and diamonds. No response was necessary from the prince. No response was expected. Accurate left the temple with the egg, escorted by 2 Imperial guards. As they walked, Accurate looked at the egg carefully. His hands shook. The Apterii belonged in the air. It was what made them superior to all other intelligent races. The privilege of flight, however, was something that was carefully guarded. Only members of the Imperial family were permitted to grow their feathers out enough to fly. They were also the only ones allowed to give dragon eggs, or rather, the eggs of dragon species that could fly. The forged dragons, stone eaters, and other ground-bound dragons were treated in Apterii society as essentially non-dragons. Nobility, such as Accurate, were allowed to grow their feathers out just enough to allow gliding, an ability that aided them greatly on the battlefield as members of the elite warrior class. The lower classes, the peasants and serfs, were not permitted to grow their feathers out enough to even permit gliding, and there were severe punishments for not keeping their wing and tail feathers neatly clipped. Maiming was the most common, but decapitation and death by burning were also possible. Accurate was honored to be one of the few Apterii to whom the Imperial house had given the honor of flight, even if it would not be his own wings that would carry him into the blue. The Imperial guards led Accurate through the great mound city known as Jura Apterii, or Fortress of the Apterii. Being now about halfway up the mound, Accurate looked out over the desert surrounding Jura Apterii. A pale blue sky met the desert's dull dusty brown, and contrasted sharply with the lush gardens, through which the Imperial guards were now leading Accurate. Legions of Apterii warriors were training down below outside the city, but still within the natural boundary of the river that both encircled and watered the great mound city. Watching the warriors, Accurate felt a strange nostalgia creep into his bones. He was once down there among them. He too put on the dragon-forged armor. He too wielded the flying beak, and a part of him longed to fight once more in the midst of the flock. The Imperial guards led him away, and, by an entrance that Accurate had never before noticed, they entered the great mound. Jura Apterii was not just a city nor simply a citadel, but a single dwelling. True, inside were many burrows, great halls, and high-domed chambers, but each was but a room, each a part of the whole. Accurate walked down the narrow halls. There were no burrows in this part of Jura Apterii. In fact, he saw no one else for almost 20 minutes, as their footsteps echoed with effort off the glazed clay walls. Hieroglyphs were carved and painted into the clay. Accurate stared at them in wonder. It was not the fact that there were hieroglyphs on the walls, as this was common on the walls of Jura Apterii. Rather, it was the content of the glyphs that surprised him. They were written in an older Apterii dialect, so Accurate struggled with the meaning, but they spoke of the dragon ancestry of the Apterii. Then they spoke of flight. Accurate's keen gaze caught every angle of the scenes of ancient battles carved into the walls. Hundreds of winged Apterii descended on a helpless foe. These were not mere legends, but history. The Apterii saw lying as weakness, and therefore immoral. Keeping a secret, or omitting the truth, however, was perfectly acceptable. The truth was right before Accurate's eyes. Flight had not always been reserved for the brood of the Imperial line. It was a revelation that would remain a secret, for the walls of the Jura would not speak. Accurate looked down at the egg still in his hands. Such a gift. Instead of being enraged that the secret of flight had been kept from him, he was honored that it was now entrusted to him, and he would guard it with his life. After leading Accurate up a series of stairs, the Imperial guards stopped and motioned toward a small burrow with a skylight. Accurate entered it and shivered. He slowly looked up at the guards. Apterii. It will be closed, a guard said to him abruptly. The click of his beak snapping together echoed in the hollow burrow, even after the guards had turned and walked back down the stairs. There was no need to watch Accurate now. There was only one entrance to this burrow. Accurate soon found out what the guard had meant, as a small team of workers came and bit by bit sealed off the burrow with clay, leaving but a small hole where bits of food and water would be given to Accurate until the egg hatched. With the solemnity with which he took the egg from the prince, Accurate now settled himself down near the small opening, cradling the egg on his feet and covering it with his feathers. This was his first task as a dragon master. For weeks on end, Accurate sat with the egg in the solitude of the starlit burrow. Once a day he was brought a fistful of grain and a small bowl of water. He supplemented his diet with whatever insects happened to crawl or fly close enough to catch without abandoning the egg. Still, hunger and thirst grew in him like a parasite, first in his stomach, weakening his body, then spreading to his mind. It overwhelmed him, and he gave in to fatigue and delusion. He heard voices, he saw visions. And always, always his thoughts dwelt on sustenance. He thought of the egg nestled beneath his feathers. He could smell it, and it was torture. It was food. It was life stirring beneath him, even as his own was diminishing. Pale clouds gathered before his eyes, and his plumage dulled. He passed out from time to time. In the fog of delirium he saw vile visions and damnable dreams. His famished mind no longer able to distinguish reality from fiction, Accurate would awake with a start and sigh with relief after finding the egg still safe beneath his feathers. After the passing of the 3 autumn moons, the life in the egg no longer stirred. It sat beneath Accurate's feathers, motionless. He picked it up and began to pace. He jerked his head around quickly as if looking for some solution or some explanation in the room around him. He flapped his arms and grew angry, cursing the egg and himself. What had gone wrong? Had he kept it warm enough? What would happen to him now? Forget about flight. He had failed to protect the egg the prince had entrusted to him. He would be lucky to leave with his head now. How long should he wait? He couldn't stay endlessly with an egg that would never hatch. What would his family think? The flock? His failure would become clear eventually. A day? A week? How long must he remain entombed with his failure before he could leave? And what punishment, what shame awaited him when he did? As Accurate was going over the various punishments that would be applied to his body, mind, and spirit, the egg tilted forward and fell from his hand. He reacted with characteristic Apterii quickness and caught it. He turned it over in his hands, and finding a small crack near the top, his stomach turned. How long had it been there? Did he crack it when he caught it? He moved his beak closer and sniffed it. To both his surprise and relief, the egg was not rotten. Then, a tap. Not so much an audible tap, but rather a very palpable tap echoed through Accurate's hands. Tap, tap. Accurate stared in wonder as the small crack in the egg grew and grew. A little nose appeared suddenly. It was a little gray nose with a bump that could hardly be called a horn. Accurate's heart began anew. He excitedly tilted his head side to side and back and forth, trying to sneak an early glimpse of the hatchling as it was emerging. 2 small ember eyes sat in the egg and slowly pushed themselves out, cautiously following the nose. They fixed on Accurate, the only other creature in the burrow. There was a look of calm confidence that Accurate did not expect in a creature so small or so young. Together they freed the hatchling from the rest of its egg. It was solid gray from head to. Accurate scanned down the hatchling's tail. White-tipped. The hatchling was a drake. Accurate had heard that Donnas were easier to train and more reliable in battle, but drakes were known to be fiercer. Accurate had been hoping for a drake. Picking a final piece of shell from the hatchling's leg, Accurate inadvertently brushed its foot. The hatchling kicked suddenly as a reflex and slipped from Accurate's grasp, falling onto the hard clay floor. It shrieked in terror and anger. Lying there on the floor, the young drake fixed a disappointed gaze smoldering on Accurate and his clumsiness. 12 years had passed, and though the hatchling had grown and changed tremendously in that time, that look of disappointment did not change. It returned again and again, from the dropping of the hatchling to Accurate's most recent missed shot. Accurate avoided the dragon's glare and drew another arrow from the quiver hanging around the drake's great neck. The enemy rider was circling wide, lighting another fire lance. Accurate and his dragon circled as well, maintaining their distance and speed. At the natural peak of the dragon's undulating movements, Accurate drew back the bowstring and quickly loosed the arrow. The enemy fire lancer fell from his steed, the glowing end of the lance still visible for a while, despite the dusty haze below. The battlefield below them was beginning to smoke. Accurate had been in enough battles to know that this was a good sign. Another good sign was the gradual disappearance of enemy dragoneers from the sky. The sounds of battle now seemed far away, in another world. Bobbing gently up and down on dragon wings, Accurate looked around at the pastel cloud ranges surrounding them. The wind rippled his feathers. It was like an ancestral dream. The hushed stories of the flocks of old, half whispered, half prayed in hidden burrows. This was what it meant to be Apterii. He glanced down. The battle continued. Men were running, falling. Apterii warriors jumped at them as they fought or fled. Dark columns of smoke rose from what Accurate assumed were enemy supply wagons. There would be no retreat across the open desert. It was the ultimate ultimatum: fight, surrender, or retreat and die from thirst and hunger. Surrender meant slavery, for men were lower than even the lowest of the Apterii. Still, when they no longer saw the possibility of victory, and they did not wish to die, either now on the end of an Apterii flying beak, or weeks from now in the desert, many chose surrender. Perhaps this was with the vague hope of later escaping, or even being rescued. It was now the task of the Apterii to make it clear that victory was no longer an option, and they faced only death or surrender. Accurate knew it was time to leave the dream world and enter the charred chasm below, blistering with battle and melted men. "Ik dirike ta rachita." "Dragon, dive down now," Accurate commanded. The dragon flapped its great wings and dove with an elegance surprising for a creature so powerful. Though it had the look of a reptile, its movements betrayed it as avian kin, and at that moment it could just as well have been a water bird diving into a crystal clear lake, and not a dragon diving into a fuming plume of acrid smoke. Despite what many might think, dragons don't like smoke any more than any other creature. The idea of going somewhere where one can neither see nor breathe goes against all instincts. An untrained fire breather will typically use smoke to conceal their movements, and rather than attack head-on through the smoke, will attack from one of the sides. The trick of attacking directly through the smoke is something that must be trained into a dragon from an early age. Some dragons take to this training, others do not. As many dragon species reach great sizes, they grow and change quickly in their youth. This also means that they are constantly hungry and on the hunt for food. Accurate's own dragon had grown immensely since his hatching, and was now roughly the size of a fawn, not including his tail and wings, which he now used as often as possible. He went quickly from catching insects and lizards to wild goats and antelope. Goats were the young drake's favorite. Antelope were fun to chase, but the goats were slow and dim-witted, and an easy meal was too tempting to resist. Had Accurate's dragon been born in the wild, he would have been taught to hunt by the Donnas of the flock. Being slightly smaller than the drakes, and with more subdued color patterns, they naturally made better hunters. Each flock had its own hunting techniques, which it passed down to its juveniles from generation to generation. Captive dragons did not have this luxury. This made them clumsy hunters at first, but it also forced them to learn their own techniques, which made them more innovative than their wild counterparts. Whether this was carefully planned by the Apterii, or if it was luck, cannot be known. But this different upbringing also made them more intelligent in battle. Accurate's dragon's obsession with goats increased to a point where Accurate found it difficult to control him. One day, the young drake abruptly left a group training exercise to chase a lone goat that he spotted in the distance. To Accurate's intense embarrassment and shame, the young drake completely ignored his calls to return, and instead continued after the goat, with Accurate doing his best to keep within earshot to try to call him back. The dragon, in his eagerness and gluttony, built up too much speed and missed the goat completely, tumbling into the ground just beyond it. The panicked goat took off, while the young drake rolled back onto his feet. Still understandably terrified, the goat did what to a goat was the most sensible thing to do. It sought the safety of its flock. The flock, on the other hand, was much less enthused to find their wayward kin barreling towards them with a young ravenous dragon in tow. Accurate's dragon was stunned to suddenly find so much food before it. He immediately set upon the nearest goat, making short work of it while the others escaped. In the future, he would learn to be patient and choose the fattest goat, but from then on he never attacked a lone goat, without first letting it run a bit in the hope that it would take the dragon to the flock. Though the impromptu hunt was a great success for the dragon, it was a shameful failure for Accurate. Accurate was punished for his inability to control his dragon, not just in that instance, but on several occasions. The young drake especially did not like diving through smoke. When trying to practice with him, Accurate made little headway and grew increasingly frustrated. His failure was not from a lack of effort. He read all the hieroglyphs on training dragons, He spoke with the other dragon breakers, and with his own instructors. He worked hard, but his commands continued to fall on indifferent ears. One day, an instructor named Iratik, a middle-aged dragon breaker with a sharp beak and crisply clipped feathers, sat down with Accurate. "Dragons are not dim-witted creatures," he said, running a talon through his feathers. "They will not do what you say just because you say it. They are not hounds or horses to be commanded. They are highly intelligent and will only listen to you when it is in their best interest. So I should command them to do things they want to do, Aka Iritik." Accurate cocked his head. Iritik shook his head once sharply. "Over time they will learn that following your commands is in their best interest, and they will begin to trust you. Once you have their trust, they will follow your commands even into death. Learn your role well, study, train, perfect your imperfections. Dragons do not respect failure." Over time and with much practice, Accurate's dragon did begin to trust his judgment, at least sometimes. Smoke diving, however, still proved to be a challenge for the pair. Accurate thought about what Iritik had told him. What was in his dragon's best interest? What was his motivation? Accurate tilted his head to the side and clicked his beak. The answer was so obvious he was ashamed he hadn't thought of it before. A few days later, Accurate took his dragon out to try smoke diving again. Once the dragon realized what the training was for that day, he froze, digging his claws into and refusing to even leave the ground. Accurate lit the fire anyway, and threw in some fresh leaves until it was impossible to see through the smoke. Standing downwind of the fire, the smoke blew right into both dragon and trainer. Then it happened. Accurate's dragon lifted his head and flared his nostrils. He shook his head furiously in protest, realizing a cruel trick was being played on him. He looked at Accurate, his eyes pleading. Accurate stared back and nodded toward the smoke. Despite all of his stubbornness and fear of the smoke, the aroma of roasted goat was too much. The young drake took off at a run. Then a leap and a couple flaps of his great wings later, he was through the smoke and tearing into the charred carcass of the goat that had been tormenting his nostrils. No goat awaited the drake at the end of this black plume of smoke. At the end he found only fire and smoke, screams and curses, spears and swords, and death. "Ik tirke daka takadaya!" "Dragon, burn them!" Accurate screeched. Before the command was even fully uttered, the drake reared his head back and coughed roughly, lighting the flame in his mouth with a flick of his tongue. A sound like a hurricane tore from the dragon's mouth as the flame leapt forth, building and swirling, mauling and melting, burning and breaking. The dragon's tar clung to the enemy, and those not incinerated in the initial blast continued to burn, their frantic screams piercing the cacophony of battle. Accurate put them down quickly with arrows. The screaming was annoying. He turned his head rapidly, trying to get his bearings. Where were they? Where had they landed? With the enemy dragoneers down and supply wagons on fire, the next objective was to divide the enemy formations. The Apterii were fierce fighters in almost all situations, but fought especially well in small groups of about a dozen or so. With room to move, they could jump and glide and fight in a way more natural to them. The Hellenican rebels that they were now fighting fought in large formations, using their sheer mass both as a weapon and shield. Together, they were quite formidable. Once separated, however, they were no match for the Apterii. "Tirikit ha-rikahi!" Dragon up! Accurate and his dragon took off, leaving the ground still burning below them. Though the smoke still obscured much, they were able to get a clear view from the air. The enemy was still mostly in mass formation, though some dragons were already working on breaking them up. Accurate watched as they dove at the enemy and spewed flaming tar in a neat line in their midst. The result from the air was quite impressive. A bright orange line cut directly through the enemy formation. Another dragon swooped for her run, and cut a matching line diagonal to the first. A shriek echoed in the air, pulling Accurate from his observations. Accurate met the call, and another rider soon appeared next to him. It was one of the captains. He gestured to the eastern half of the enemy formation. "Yaka irita!" he yelled, indicating the pattern that was to be cut into it. Chi! Accurate responded quickly and hurried toward the formation. Another Apterii Dragoneer had just started the first cut on that side. As Accurate and his dragon approached the formation, they could see trails of several fire lances chasing the Dragoneer. All misses. Still, there were so many of them. The rebels had come prepared to fight dragons. Accurate and his dragon gained some altitude. Tirikit, Yiriha! Dragon, are you ready? The great drake snorted and clicked his tongue, once again lighting a small flame in the back of his mouth. Accurate swallowed hard and looped his bow on his side. He gripped his dragon with both hands and gave the command. They dove, picking up great speed. The enemy came clearly into view, not just their formation, but the warriors, their armor, their weapons, their faces. Their faces turned on Accurate and his dragon. Curses, commands. About 3 seconds from the enemy, the drake let loose a stream of fire into their ranks. Accurate counted quietly in his head, both out of training habit and to keep himself calm. Ia, ko, ar, rek, ket. Tiny flames lit up on either side of them. Fire lances. Accurate kicked his dragon firmly in the side and the drake ended the run, but he did not gain altitude as was expected. Instead, he stayed low to the formation. So low, in fact, that Accurate feared that they would be impaled on the many enemy spears below them. Accurate kicked again. Again. The dragon snorted and roped in protest, staying as low as possible. Behind them, Accurate saw the flash of the fire lances, exploding in the empty air. Accurate's dragon flapped his great wings and ascended back into the cloud cover. Accurate sighed. The drake was right. The fire lancers would never fire that close to their own soldiers. It was not the first time that he had saved them by disobeying Accurate's orders. The forge master held out a small but heavy hammer, and 3 spikes about the length of Accurate's forearm. Chi hariik. What's this? Accurate asked, taking them and fixing them into his belt. Tai tiriketa. For the dragon, the forge master responded, turning and grabbing another set of hammer and spikes to hand to the Dragoneer in line behind Accurate. Leaving the forge, the Dragoneers tried to talk as casually as they could, about fights they'd been in, females they were supposedly courting, or anything else to try to make the day seem normal. There was, however, no talk of plans for tomorrow, or for the future in general, for today was not normal, and none of the new Dragoneers wanted to tempt fate. The talking died down and then stopped completely when the Dragoneers reached the yard, where their dragons were being fitted with armor and harnesses for the Dragoneers' equipment. After a small briefing, they mounted their dragons and were off. It wasn't Accurate's first patrol, but it was his first time patrolling from the sky. The cloud ranges and wind streams replaced the mountains and wadis he was used to, and he found himself oddly disoriented in this new world. They had been flying in a formation with 2 other Dragoneers for about 10 minutes when Accurate heard a screech from the lead scout. Enemy. Where? Accurate looked around, angling and cocking his head trying to peer between the layers of clouds, but he could see nothing. He clutched his bow in his talons. Where? The clouds drifted closer to the formation, and soon the Dragoneers could not even see each other, but Accurate could still hear them calling. Then a sudden sound ripped the air apart in a violent flash of light just beyond the clouds. It was the first fire lance he had ever seen. Down below, a winged silhouette soared by. Tirikit chikarit! Dragon, move! Accurate was tired of waiting and wanted to get into the action. They dove and followed the Dragoneer, still unsure if it was friend or foe. The Dragoneer seemed to be leading them away from the battle. As the cloud cover grew thinner, it became clear that it was indeed an enemy Dragoneer. Accurate increased the pressure from his knees, urging his dragon on, and he fingered the fletching of an arrow. Tirikit ik, chikarit! Accurate repeated the command. The dragon, however, slowed down, and began to turn his head from side to side. Tirikit ik! Accurate kicked the drake in the sides. The drake responded with a furious snort and shook his head. Instead of pursuing the enemy, the dragon dove, straight down. The sudden, unexpected dive caused Accurate to drop the arrow, and his bow, but he managed to hold on to the dragon as he turned the dive into a spiral. In the midst of a blur of pastels, Accurate caught a trail of smoke and heat, and then another, and another. Then, boom, boom, boom! The fire lances exploded all around, the concussion of the blasts disorienting him. He clung to the dragon's neck until they were back in the safety of the cloud cover. After they had landed safely back in Apterii, Accurate was punished severely for dropping his bow. But he was incredibly grateful that that was all he lost that day. Many battles had passed since that first patrol, and though this most recent battle raged on, the outcome was becoming clear. Apterii dragoneers continued to cut off small groups of rebels from the main army. Those cut off were quickly cut down by rapid vicious assaults from the Apterii groups, waiting for such an opportunity. Still, the rebels fought furiously. They had been advancing for weeks, capturing strongholds and fortresses, and putting to flight armies far more experienced than themselves. They knew this was their only chance, and they had thrown everything they had into this offensive. Accurate kept low on the dragon's back as they finished the pass. They climbed higher into the sky, wheeling around to prepare for another one. As they wheeled, Accurate admired the neat glowing smoking line they had just made in the flesh and steel down below. They dove again. A heat of fire lances passed by them. Accurate raised his body briefly, fired an arrow quickly, and pressed himself once again on the dragon's neck. He could feel the muscles in the neck move as the dragon's tar glands opened and pumped liquid tar through its flame and into the rows of rebels below. As they began their ascent back into the safety of the clouds and smoke, they heard a pained, thundering, vibrating shriek. A dragon had been hit. It had not only been hit, but something had penetrated its armor and thick hide. A fire lance? Accurate had heard no explosion accompanying the shriek. The rumors of enemy arrows that could penetrate plate armor came back to his mind. Arrows like that could certainly down a dragon. Accurate and his dragon turned, arcing high in the sky. Straining his eyes, Accurate could see where the dragon had fallen. It was being quickly dispatched by several rebels. More shrieks, a final burst of flame and valorous vengeance, and then it went silent and dark. Accurate froze. He knew the next cut, yet he struggled giving the command. The words got caught in his throat and clung there. Was this instinct? Was it fear? He knew the range of his bow firing down was greater than that of the ones firing up. Should they risk it and complete the run? Should they gain altitude and weaken their ranks from a safer distance first? While he was trying to decide what to do, his dragon had already made up his mind. "Tirket ekko!" Accurate screeched. The simple command was ignored. The dragon dove with all the strength and speed he could muster. The drakes were always more fearless in battle. Accurate had always wanted a drake. Still, Accurate tried frantically to rein in his dragon. He kicked and cursed and pleaded, until they neared the ground and the smoke from the battlefield choked his cries. Arrows whizzed by. Accurate flattened his body against the dragon, barely able to hold on. The drake grunted as an arrow hit its mark. Accurate could not see where, but he felt a convulsion of pain shoot through the drake's body. Still the drake pressed on, opening his mouth and spewing flames into his enemies. More arrows, more hits. The dragon grunted and roked. Finishing the run, the dragon had neither strength nor will to continue flying, but sailed just beyond the enemy, and hit hard on the ground near a group of Apterii, waiting for their turn to fight. His wings flapped around, throwing them to the ground. His tail swung around. Accurate barely managed to hold on as his dragon thrashed about in agony. The drake shook his head furiously, roking and coughing blood and tar. He circled and swirled, and in a fury, spewed flaming tar all around. The pain was blinding. Accurate dug his talons in to avoid being thrown off. He held his eyes shut, hoping it would all end, but the thrashing continued, the yells and shrieks of wounded Apterii being added to the drake's pained roking. Accurate knew what he had to do. Still his hands moved slowly and dully. The hammer weighed heavy in his belt. The spikes felt long and awkward. He pulled a spike from his belt and placed it at the base of the drake's great neck. He raised the hammer. He brought it down. The drake roared and shook. Accurate hit the spike again, harder. He quickly grabbed another. The drake spun and lost his footing. The spike flew out of Accurate's grasp and landed in the dirt below them. He grabbed the last spike and held it tightly, his talons digging into the flesh of his palm. He placed the spike next to the first and pounded it into his dragon's spine with a gut-wrenching crack. The drake collapsed heavily in the dirt, the impact knocking the wind out of Accurate. Dust rose up around them. Accurate could hear screams. They were the screams of Apterii wounded and dying from dragon fire. He looked around. Fire, death, pain, failure. Estoran fen. So that is the end of Dragon Breaker. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I enjoyed writing it. I really like the Apterii culture, and there will be more stories coming from this part of the world of Spirit and Shield. So stay tuned for those. In 2 weeks, I will post another video addressing any comments or questions that you had about either this story or the world of the Apterii or Spirit and Shield in general. So go ahead and get those comments down below, or you can always contact me on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Go ahead and get those comments in, and we will talk about them in 2 weeks. That also gives you plenty of time to share this story with your friends. It's actually kind of cool. Some of my family, some of my cousins are following my stories as well, and it gives us something additional to talk about, which is I think it's pretty cool. So go ahead and share it with your friends, and we'll meet back here in a couple weeks. I am beginning to submit these stories to short story contests. So on that note, I am looking for beta readers so I can polish these up a bit more and fix any issues that I have going on in them, be it grammar, structure, or plot holes, things that just don't make any sense. So if you're interested in being one of my beta readers, go ahead and contact me, and I can send you the script for one of my stories. So I guess that's all for right now. So again, see you in 2 weeks for the commentary on Dragon Breaker. And the week after that video comes out, I will have another short story for you, hopefully. That one is called A Meeting with Giants. So already writing that one. It's coming out pretty well. I'm excited. So I guess that's all for right now. Thank you again, as always, for joining me on this journey, and I will see you later. Okay, until then, take care.